So today's topic is roles, personas, and customer journeys, challenges and misconceptions. So when we discussed running a webinar within the service design field, this came out as a very obvious choice for immediate discussion. And then we had a prep call about the content, and if that's anything to go by, then there'll be plenty of debate and healthy discussion today. So what we've actually got, we've got a mix of input from my colleague Jonathan. Then I'm going to work through some questions with our expert panel, some of the key discussion points, and then I'll pick out some questions from attendees. So if you can get into the chat function, you will remain on mute, but if you can add any comments, observations, any nifty insights you have to add to the equation, I'll pick as much of that up as possible, but that'll be towards the end of the hour slot. Okay, so I'm going to hand to Jonathan, if you want to take it away, young man.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Lawrence, and welcome everyone. Happy Friday to you all. So thanks for joining us. So Lawrence has outlined the format of today. So I'm going to talk for around 25 minutes to half an hour on the subjects of roles, user roles, personas, and customer journeys. I'm going to look at the challenges and misconceptions with regard to those techniques. For those of you that haven't come across me before, I work for Assist Knowledge Development. I'm the Service Development Director for Assist. I've had the absolute honour of contributing to a few industry publications with my colleagues, Debbie and others. I'm also the co-architect of this qualification you can see here in the right-hand corner, the A4Q Certified Service Designer Award. And some of you may have seen me or heard of me and my colleagues in that podcast, and I can see a few friendly faces that have joined the podcast as well. So welcome to those of you that are here. Let's move on then. Outcomes for today. So when you're looking at this world of service design, you've got to think about the customer and you've got to think about outcomes always. So I thought I'd start with outcomes. So the outcomes of today, we're going to look at, well, what are these three techniques? We're going to look at the challenges and misconceptions in the use of the techniques. And I'm hoping that stems some ideas ready for the panel discussion towards the end of the webinar. And obviously we've got that panel discussion at the end. So let's have a look at user roles. So a user role is a collection of job holders or actors that share common tasks with either a business system or an information technology system. And what you can see on the slide is an example of user roles, a subsection of user roles for a business system that would be a hotel. And what you can see is you've got the guest, the receptionist, manager, and cleaner. Now, one of the things that gets confused about user roles is that a single individual can perform more than one role. So the receptionist role may also at times be a cleaner, or the cleaner might be a guest, or the manager might take on the receptionist role. And it's maybe not as clear in the diagram that I'm showing you as it could be, but the notation has them as separate. And what it does is it allows you to build up your understanding, start discussion with regard to the individual user roles and the functions and tasks that they predominantly want to focus in on. Things to consider are the features, the frequency of use of the business or the IT system, what's their degree of experience in the domain, their relative level of technology proficiency, and what's their goal in using the user role or using the business or IT system. So you can see here, we've got some pictures, we've got a smart speaker. Perhaps the goal at the end is to sit and enjoy a movie with your family. And you can see that there's different levels of domain proficiency and technical proficiency. There's just some considerations when you're describing the user role to consider these aspects. So let's look at some examples then of those aspects. So you can see that the receptionist user role has a different set of features that they're accessing, that they're looking to engage in comparison to the manager user role. You can see different levels of frequency, different levels of domain experience. They've got the same level of technical proficiency in this example, and they've got different goals in their user roles. And I just want to reiterate, the manager could take on the receptionist role in addition to obviously their management responsibilities. Let's now look at some challenges and misconceptions in the use of this technique. Often people mix this up with persona analysis. We're going to talk about persona analysis. It's our second technique. There's also a challenge with people feeling that they don't have the time to do this analysis. And I think that that's a real problem. We should always have the time to do the thinking. And if we miss one of these major user roles that we can see relative to our business or IT system, we may miss a key area of functionality or key solution area that we need to focus in on in order to meet the requirements for the individual user roles. The other thing that I think is quite challenging when you're considering user roles are the definition of security and access levels, which obviously links us through to non-functional requirements. We have to consider internal user roles. So sometimes when we're doing this, we might just think of the external user roles or the typical ones, and it's important that we think about things like renewal and maintenance. Audit, for example, might be a user role that might not be the first one that you think about, but if we miss the audit user role, then we may cause ourselves some problems later on. So it is useful to think about those internal user roles. I'd also suggest that it's useful to think about extreme users. There's a technique that you may have come across called misuse cases. But I think we could think about, well, who might be the users that might seek to cause damage or to extract theft from the business or the IT system. And then lastly, I think one of the challenges is for us to consider non-human actors. So would it be possible for artificial intelligence to be a user role, for example? Might it be possible for a user role to be fulfilled by an animal? Could your guest be, for example, a dog, or might someone bring a tortoise to the hotel, and how might you deal with that? And it helps with scenario analysis, but is a challenge, I think. Misconceptions. Lots of people mix this up with job titles. Your job title is different to your user role. You might be the I don't know, fire safety coordinator at the hotel. That might be your job title, but you might fulfill the user role of manager or receptionist, and it doesn't impact your job title or your job or role description. There's I think a big misconception that this technique is aligned only to big upfront design and therefore only aligned to the waterfall software and change delivery lifecycle. I think it can be used in agile, waterfall, any change delivery lifecycle that you care to mention. This is about thinking. This is about thinking about what are the features that our users may want to access. And then the other big misconception that I'd suggest is that this isn't needed. This is absolutely needed. If you're working from a backlog of user stories and you miss a user role, you're going to miss a whole tranche of user stories for that user role. And therefore, you're going to have some fairly disgruntled stakeholders or the potential for disgruntled stakeholders. So that's our first technique. The next technique we're going to look at, I think, is slightly more popular, maybe used a bit more often. And it's personas. And I really like personas. What they are, they're an imagined representation of a user role. So they're a technique that is used in addition to or in combination with the user role technique. And let's have a look at an example. So we've got our hotel and we've got the guest that we introduced earlier. And what we're doing here is we're trying to bring this user role to life, and we're giving the user role a name. And you can see the examples of different types of guests here. We've got Alex, Sam, and Nabil. Now, each of these individuals has different wants and needs. They've got different personalities, characteristics, and they may have different goals relative to being a guest. So hopefully that visual of how the two techniques are combined and indeed different is useful for you. In terms of considerations, when you're using persona analysis, it's useful to consider whether or not your persona is based on user research, and that would make it a validated persona. So if you've got data that backs up your definition of a persona, it's known as a validated persona. And if you're in the mode of working with the persona where you're imagining what might be the characteristics of a persona, it's known as a proto or an ad hoc persona. So this distinguishes it from a validated persona. Validated is based on data. A proto persona is imagined and is not based upon data. In terms of using the technique, different organizations choose how to use this. Some organizations have a centralized view of the personas. Sometimes the custodians of those personas are the change team. Sometimes it's in the marketing team. But what it does is it gives a standard view of the personas across the organizations. And there's sometimes quite a lot of advantages of that because you get common understanding across all of the departments as to who are the personas. Other organizations might take a federated approach. So each individual change team works on the build and development of the personas, maybe on a project by project basis. They create their own personas. Some still mix up the centralized and the federated approach to kind of get the best of both worlds. One of the things that you also need to consider when you're using this technique is the breadth of the personas. How many do you need? And I think this might come up in the panel discussion a little later on, but there's advantages of having quite a small subset of personas. And if you extend it too much, there can be a risk that people get confused as to, well, who are the personas that we're targeting, that we want to think about when we're developing our business services. I think accessibility and inclusivity are also key considerations for the use of this technique. Some organizations are, for example, creating personas for individuals with accessibility needs. And what it does is it helps to bring accessibility requirements and service requirements to the fore in terms of the discussion. And I think that that can only be a positive for our work as service designers. Let's have a look at some examples then. So you can see the names of the personas. We have pictures of the people. So what this does is it humanizes the work. We're thinking about people as we're conducting the work of service design. You can see elements in terms of descriptions of occupations and character descriptions. You can see a little bit of information about content preference and motivations, goals for using, in this instance, the hotel. It's interesting because if you look at, for example, Nabil wanting peace and quiet versus what it is that Sam is prioritizing, you start to sense a different type of customer, and that might influence your requirements. It might influence the design of your service experiences. Some challenges: getting it mixed up with the user role analysis is a big challenge. If you've created a broad volume of personas, you've got to think about, well, how are you going to maintain them and renew them? How do you make sure that they're accessible by your change team and that they're kept up to date? It can be difficult to create the personas. And one of the difficulties that's related to this technique is the accusation of stereotyping. I think you need to be really careful in using the technique. It would be quite lazy, for example, for you to create a persona of someone who's retired and is unable to communicate using mobile technology. And it might be that you can create that persona, but what you're doing is you're dismissing lots of people that are retired, are very much technically literate. And I think you've got to be thinking about someone who's retired who won't get off their Instagram account because they're constantly posting photos to their friends and family. And you've got to be careful in the use of this technique to not stereotype needlessly and to not be, what I'd suggest, be lazy in kind of the creation of the personas. You've really got to think about what you're doing, and is it representative of the customers, the users of your business or IT service. I think one of the other challenges is making sure that you've got a representation of both your current customers, your stakeholders, and a representation of perhaps those customers or stakeholders that you want to target. And so if you're using data to develop your personas, you may or may not have data on your target customers. Some misconceptions one of the biggest misconceptions is that creating personas and developing them is easy. I disagree with that quite strongly. I think if you're creating validated personas that are based on data, you've really got to think about what you're doing. You've got to challenge each other. You've got to challenge each other's biases and misconceptions and work with your team to develop rigorous personas. Some people perceive that you can only use personas in an external customer-facing context. You can use personas to describe internal users of internal services and systems, and I would encourage you to do that. But again, you've got to be mindful of not stereotyping a particular individual within your organization. There is a misconception that personas are only used in the Agile context. They're great for the Agile context, but can be used in any other change or software delivery lifecycle context. And in addition, there's a misconception that you don't need to do personas if user role analysis has been completed. There are different lenses on actors, and both complement each other and can help with your analysis of the service and the requirements for that service. Right, our final technique, we're getting there. So customer journey maps is our final technique. So this is the structure of a customer journey map that we'd suggest would be quite useful. So you start with a persona and the goal of the persona. So you have an imagined human in mind as you are creating the customer journey map. It's intended to be human customer-centric. You have the high-level stages, and this should include the stages prior, during, and after the consumption of or use of the product or service that you're mapping the customer journey map for. You then describe the activities of the customer during each stage. So you're starting to fill out some detail and understand what the customer is doing at each of the stages. You're also describing their perceptions of the journey during each stage and describing their emotional state. Now you can use these kind of symbols like plus and minus. Some people use red, amber, green. I've seen emojis be used to describe the emotions. Some people put the names of the emotions down there at the bottom of the customer journey map to describe that someone's feeling excited or angry or whatever the emotion is that they're experiencing. The final thing that I just want to mention with the customer journey map is that it helps you to identify potential opportunities for improvement. So you're not mapping this for the sake of mapping it, you're doing it with a view of how do we improve the service that this customer is engaged with. So let's have a look at an example. I've moved forward too quickly. So just considerations. You've got to do the research. You can't just make these up. You have to really consider which customer journey maps do you want to delve into and analyze and understand what is going on with regard to your customer journeys. There are other techniques that can help you here, data investigation, doing things like service safaris, observation, shadowing, focus groups. There's lots and lots of techniques that you can use to help you with your research that we're not going to have time to consider here. The other consideration that I'd suggest is extremely necessary is that you're looking at all touch points. So if you all touch points before, during, and after the consumption of the service or product, and it's across process, organizational touch points. It might be people that you've spoken to, and it might be information technology as well. So it's not a technology-centric model. You're looking at all the touch points, and you can see the picture of the Poppet model just there. It's useful to think about scenarios, and this we'll come on to it in a short while, but which customer journeys do you want to map? And which scenarios do you want to paint a picture of and build understanding of? Is it that you want to map your unhappy paths or all your happy paths, or a combination of those? You've got to think, well, which scenarios are to be prioritized for this type of modeling? And then the final consideration is the link to other blueprints. Some people will mix up the customer journey map with what I'll describe as a service blueprint. And the two techniques are related, but are distinct and separate. The service blueprint includes the back office activities that underpin each of the touch points, whereas the customer journey map purely shows the customer facing activities and perceptions. So I will now show you an example, which I'd said I was going to do a moment ago. So you can see a persona now of a dad. They're a busy change professional, and they've had their arm twisted to go and stay at a hotel with the family dog. So we've got this example of a persona or user role being a non-human actor in here. So you can see the activities. At the start, they're researching available hotels, they're comparing options and prices, and they're trying to not take the dog, but they're considering whether or not that is a good or a bad idea. They're researching where they can park and finding out that there's not that many hotels that actually allow you to take a dog as a guest. Then book the hotel, they're receiving the confirmation of the reservation, and they're a little bit worried about the location of the hotel because they haven't got a great deal of choice in the city that they're looking at. A few days before their stay, they ring the hotel and check that a dog-friendly room has been reserved and that it's okay to bring the dog. They don't want to be in a strange city and not have any accommodation for their family or their dog. They're pleased by the prompt response and happy with the service level provided. So you can see the emotions at this point are going from amber up to green. Then they arrive at the hotel, they pay for their parking, and they receive this really odd request to weigh their dog. And they find out as they check in that if the dog's over 25 kilograms, they have to pay an additional surcharge. And you can see what this happens, as this happens, that they're confused. They're not quite so sure why the terms and conditions weren't made clearer, particularly given that they've rung up a few days before. And they're disappointed that they've got this additional charge, but they kind of feel that they don't really have a great deal of choice. And you can see their emotional state goes red at this point relative to this touch point. They chill out, they walk their dog, they explore the city, they enjoy the vibrancy of the local area, and you can see their emotional state improves. They use the hotel's facilities, everything's going fine at this point. They think the breakfast is fine. So you can see that's a green emotional state relative to the touch points at this stage of the customer journey. But then on checkout, they're told there's another additional charge to clean the room that hasn't been made clear and transparent up front. And because of the lack of communication, this particular persona complains and raises a complaint to the hotel manager. It is eventually rescinded, the charge is waived, but they're very frustrated and they're very angry. And this is their lasting memory of this hotel, is that they are trying to put on another additional charge on top of the charges that have already been made relative to taking the dog into the hotel. So what I hope that this does is help to bring to life the technique and show you a tangible example of the ups and downs in terms of the emotions. We're trying to provide you with this tool, a human-centric approach to service design, and it's a really key technique in combination with the other two techniques that we've discussed obviously on the call. Some challenges, and there are lots of challenges with regard to using customer journey maps. How many scenarios should we cover? What's the breadth and depth of the insights that we need to obtain, and how many different actions and touch points should we be mapping against? If you've got a wealth of customer journey maps, you also have a maintenance and renewal challenge. So if you've got quite a large organization with lots of different customer journey maps, you've got to think about, well, how do we maintain and renew these? How do we make them available to our change practitioners that need access to these customer journey maps? How do you make sure they're kept up to date when you make your service improvements and you hopefully, for example, make the terms and conditions clearer for that hotel? Your customer journey map is then out of date potentially. You've got to do the research. You don't want to be making decisions around prioritizing improvement actions based on customer journey maps that provide a false picture of what really is going on with regard to your customers and their touch points. You've got to think about inconsistencies between the personas and the customer journey maps as well. You need to be thinking about, how do you combine these tools? How do you have consistency and alignment between them? If you've got a customer journey map that is, for example, telling you that everything's positive in a customer journey, and it's showing you a very happy path with all green touch points, but there's a scenario where they're all red, you've got to balance that inconsistency and have a discussion with regard to what is or isn't going on. It's a great way of providing information in a fairly clear visual way. And I think it should be used as an aid to communication. So it's a start of a conversation in terms of what should we be doing in terms of prioritizing our efforts to improve our customer journeys. There is a number of misconceptions as well. One of the misconceptions is that if you've got a red touch point or an amber touch point, that they must be turned green. That's not true. You have a choice, and it may be there are certain touch points outside of your control, and it might be acceptable within certain circumstances to just think about moving a red touch point up to amber. And that might be acceptable. It does depend on the value proposition of the organization and its strategic priorities with regard to what it wants to do. There's a big challenge as well with the tool being mixed up with what's called a user journey map. I stay away from user journey maps personally, and I'll suggest that the term user helps with predominantly thinking about IT touchpoints. So there's a risk if we're using this term user journey map that we're only thinking about the technology touchpoints, and deliberately use this term customer journey map in order to think across all touchpoints, irrespective of whether or not they're technology or non-technology touchpoints. That might be controversial for some of you, and you might want to use citizen rather than customer, but just be mindful that if you're using a user journey map, there's a risk that through that language, you're encouraging people subconsciously to only focus on the technology touchpoints. There is also a misconception that it's the same tool as a service blueprint. It is not the same tool. They are related tools. The service blueprint shows you the back office activities that sit and underpin each of the touch points. And there's also a misconception that you can only use this tool for external customer journeys. You can use this tool to analyze and assess your internal user journeys, and employee journey is as relevant and useful to document using this technique as an external customer journey map. So I think that's now allowed us to cover all of the three outcomes. And I think, Lawrence, I've stuck to time. So hopefully now you've got a good understanding of what is a user, what are user roles, what are personas and customer journey maps, what are the challenges and misconceptions, and I'm hopeful that that's helped to stimulate some thinking ready for our Q&A panel. So now over to the Q&A discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing at this point over my slides. I just want to thank you all for your time, for listening, and look forward to our discussions now.
Thanks, Jonathan. That's given us a really good intro. What I'm going to do, we did do some pre-prepared questions. I'll try and feed in some aspects that have come through the chat as we go as well, which will be interesting. Thinking on your feet, Lawrence. There you go. There's always a first time. But if our panel can relay anything in the chat as well, that'd be really helpful. So, first question. I'm going to come to you, Pip, if that's okay. But how do you overcome the challenges of writing personas? Are there any dangers in getting it wrong, perhaps?
Yeah, it's one job that I find really, really difficult. And I find it takes me a long time, and I'm never 100% confident with the personas that I create. Jonathan warned earlier about the challenges and the dangers of stereotyping, and that's always something that I'm conscious of, and also about being representative. So I tend to find I use my extremes. I have a representative from the data that I've got, and then the extremes, but then they get the way that their characteristics interrelate. I find very, very difficult. So actually, I'm very interested to see what the other panel's members answer on this, because I'd like to learn some tricks myself.
Kay, do you want to join in?
I think it's really difficult to decide how much research is sufficient, how much data is sufficient for the personas I'm trying to create. And what I personally find helpful is moving away from demographic information such as age, gender, income, and really focusing on the values, goals, and behaviors. And what's also helpful in trying to think about how many personas is sufficient is looking at just tying back to the roles. So what are the core tasks that my customers or users are trying to achieve? How do they overlap? And trying to group them to see whether the number of personas you have covers the core tasks you have. So the personas are really useful when it's used alongside identifying roles. I hope that helps a little bit, but I do find that you can get into a hole in trying to cover all your bases and ending up with too many personas, and that isn't actually helpful, because when it comes to designing experiences and decision making, too many personas can be overwhelming.
Okay. Debbie, do you want to give us your two penneth?
Okay, my two penneth. I do agree with what Kay and Pip have just said. I always like to think about goals and outcomes, and whether people have different goals and outcomes, you know, different needs to be achieved. And that's sort of around things like experience, as well as more tangible outcomes as well. I completely agree with the comment about stereotyping. And I think the one thing that I really believe in is putting your analytical mindset on and not allowing yourself to make assumptions just because that's how you've experienced something, or somebody you know have experienced it. So, you know, obviously, if you've got research data, that's very helpful, because that can help you to prioritize and categorize a bit. But I think you do have to always think it through, and you have to ask yourself the question, am I leaping to something here? Because that happens to tie in with the way I think about things. The other thing I do think is that framework that Jonathan showed is really, really helpful, because it actually helps you to think about the characteristics from a number of different dimensions. And sometimes in your organization, it's useful to start by thinking about the dimensions that are relevant to your personas, and then maybe build the characteristics around that, rather than sometimes leaping to dimensions just because that's the way people have always done personas. Because I think there is a bit of an element, and that ties back into the stereotyping. So I think have a bit of a thinking about the different dimensions before you start leaping into them.
Just
Jonathan,
thinking about it. Sorry, Lawrence. Just thinking about it, the most successful time I've managed to create personas, I didn't create them. I was working in a group. We didn't create them as individuals, human people. We created a series of responses in those different attribute characteristics, and then we sort of numbered them 1 to 10, and we picked one of those, one of those, and one of those to make the human, so that it was, you know, it deliberately wasn't anybody that anybody knew, or, you know, that kind of thing. So we made sure we covered all the attributes, all the range of, you know, experiences and goals and all the rest of it. But when we actually put them together with the demographic information that Kay was talking about to make them real, that was done sort of randomly, and that, I think, that was the most successful group of personas we managed to create.
Take some of the subjective element away. Yeah, I can see that. Mr. Hunsley?
So, I just want to add and build on Pip's point around this should be a team effort. So I think service design has to be collaborative. We're going to co-create value for customers. We're going to co-create our personas. We co-create all of the artifacts. And what this does is it helps us to see other perspectives beyond our own. And it helps to challenge maybe some of the inbuilt bias. I really like that random allocation approach that you've taken, Pip, because that takes away that risk of potential bias that one individual might have relative to a single persona. So yeah, collaboration and challenging each other's assumptions and suggestions for ideas has to be part of the way that you develop the personas, I think, and all of the artifacts that you might use as well.
I think you've started to answer the second question in terms of thinking about biases. I won't mention the two Ronnies answering the question before last, because my references are so out of date these days. But does anyone want to add anything about mitigating biases? Because I can see that it's very easy with best intentions to be working with personas to actually introduce more issues than you started out with potentially. So anything to safeguard on that front? Pip, that was, I like that you introduced there. Kay, anything else around biases that you've been conscious of?
I think it goes back to something Debbie mentioned. We need to challenge any assumptions that we might have. And one way of doing this is actually listing out the assumptions you have and testing that afterwards with either further research or data. So that would help really mitigate on some of these biases that we might accidentally introduce in the personas.
You're back on Jonathan's point of the team, so you can get different viewpoints. Yeah.
Sometimes it's useful to go outside of the team to get someone who's not been involved in the creation of the persona, for example, to check it. And if they've not been involved, they might come across a perspective they haven't considered. So they're able to give objective feedback, and the team has to be open to that objective feedback, because the end goal is to have a robust persona and to get something that works, would be my suggestion.
Can I also add something? Yeah, because I really believe in collaboration. I believe in teams, but one thing I have perceived is groupthink. And sometimes a person's assumption can become the team's assumption. And because we're human beings who try to engage with each other, sometimes we go along with assumptions because it's become part of the way the team is thinking, and there's an acceptance in that, and that's not good either. So I do think we have to be prepared to look at these personas and ask ourselves, are there underlying assumptions here, and are we as a team engaging in groupthink? Because that can lead you in a very, very difficult direction. I think also coming back to something that Jonathan said, actually talking to people who maybe aren't part of the collaborating team and getting them to maybe come forward with their ideas, possibly even trying something out and highlighting what they thought were important features, can actually tell you something about the personas as well. So I would say be very wary of groupthink, and always be prepared to understand that because we are nice, engaging people, sometimes we can go along with things that actually don't stand up, because at the end of the day, we're still analysts, and therefore we've got to still be analytical.
I just wonder if anyone's got any insights or examples from Joe Gray's question about data-led ways of validating personas. I don't know if anyone's had any experience or heard of other case studies where that's been particularly at the forefront around very data-driven personas they could share.
I've got a sort of an example, but it's the opposite of a good example. Well, no, it's a good example, but it's the opposite of a good outcome.
I'm taking it. I'm taking it.
Take it. Okay, and Colin has got his hand up, so we must come to him then, Lawrence. Okay.
I beg your pardon.
My example is one that I can't go into a lot of detail on, but I have heard of a company where the company leadership decided that their key customer persona looked in a particular way and had certain characteristics, and focused their marketing on that. And I believe it was based on some marketing research, but it didn't have an overlay of actually thinking, is what is coming out of this data actually correct for our organization? Okay. And they then changed strategy and focused on that persona, and the company nearly folded. It was a very, very drastic situation. And that's the problem with data, is that you have to look at it and you have to question it, because we all read studies and reports that tell us that data has said this, and I'm one of those people that do this, but what about? But did they consider that aspect? Because if we analyze, then actually we ask questions of data, and we accept that sometimes the data set is limited, sometimes it's biased, because the people who've maybe answered the questions are people who like answering questions about that stuff. So we have to always ask ourselves, what is the cohort, if you like, who provided that data, and therefore, is it a realistic sample? And I do think questioning data is one approach to that we have to take on.
Thank you for that. Neil, could you help in unmuting young Colin for a moment? I think he's got a question. If not, we could put it in the chat maybe. Is that okay?
I think I've been unmuted. That's fine. No, I was just going back to the bias thing about the group thinking, which I think is a really interesting concept. One of the things that I've come across mostly in the financial services industry, I must admit, is the hippo effect of the highest paid person's opinion. So everybody might be having a discussion and saying, "Wow, this is really where we need to go," or "This is a challenge," and because it's a very senior person or a director say, "Absolutely not, this is what we're doing," everybody goes, "Oh yeah, that is a great idea." And so it's just I've seen that a lot in terms of bias, that you need to be very mindful that the most senior person, everybody just follows their opinion when most people in the room think that's not the right thing to do, but they go along with it.
Yeah, that's quite dangerous, I think. No, it's a really good point, and I'm taking hippo. We'll have that one. Thank you.
Can I say, Lawrence, I think that example that Colin's just given is exactly what happened in that organisation I was talking about, that somebody very senior had a very, we need to move and target this type of customer, without actually understanding that probably other people in the organisation could have disputed that, and that wasn't part of the culture. So we come into culture there as well, don't we?
I think something, can I add one point to that? I think something that helps, I'm also working in financial services right now, but if we adopt some of the design thinking tools and methodology, we can help mitigate the hippo effect. So for example, some of the things people are already adopting is, putting things on post-its without names, doing dot voting, so it's anonymous, doing activities like round robin, so you're all adding to each other's ideas. So these techniques can help kind of mitigate the hippo effect.
Thanks. Good.
And if I may, it's also, I'd like to challenge the definition of data. So automatically we consider data, I consider the data to be spreadsheets worth of survey responses, market research, whatever it might be that says, so many % of our customers have this attribute or this behavior or whatever it is. I'm currently doing a piece of work where I'm asking everybody in my business unit that I'm working with to describe the customer. We're going to come on to different techniques that help, but I've given them free rein to describe our target customer. So I've got the CEO involved, and I've got the guy with the screwdriver in his yellow coat on the ground describing, who our customer is. And it's really interesting to see that data come back and then validate the personas based on that data, not necessarily, so it's subjective data, but because of the volume, it becomes less subjective. And using that as my benchmark to say, actually, are my personas representative of all these different perspectives of who our customer is and how they act?
That's really useful. Thanks for sharing that, Pip. I'm going to move us on a little. And just if you've got sort of 30 seconds each, if you've had some of those tools and techniques from Jonathan, but have you got any other pet, should we say pet techniques? I like to say pet a lot, but any pet techniques you'd recommend if you think about analysing or designing services? Go on, Jonathan, I know you're itching to get that one.
So I think customer insight, understanding the voice of the customer, absolutely key. And it kind of links to Joe Gray's question a little bit. If you've got an interest in who your customers are and what they might want or need, their perceived or stated needs as a company, it's kind of just showing that interest, and speaking with customers is it's one of my preferred techniques. If you want to find out about the customers, have a conversation with your customers. And all too often there seems to be a barrier, be it real or imagined, with regard to speaking to customers. And I think we've got to try and challenge that barrier and be mindful of the principles and the policies of the organizations that we work in and the context, but talk to real people and understand their real experiences. There are lots and lots of tools that I mentioned a few, and I'm sure the panel members will mention a number as well, but have a conversation and be inquisitive, and that really helps you to find out what are the customer journeys and what are the touch points and how are people thinking and feeling. And it can give you an insight from a qualitative perspective that can be really useful in addition to your more quantitative research investigation techniques.
Okay, I can see you nodding away, raring to go.
I very much agree with what Jonathan's saying there, and I think one technique I found really helpful is testing those assumptions, and especially if you are working in an agile way, you can start testing assumptions early so that when you're designing a service or a product, okay, so I've got an example. I've seen a service, a multi-million-pound service that was developed with the assumption of certain user behaviors. And these assumptions weren't tested early on. So the service was launched and the uptake was low, as in less than 1,000 people. So this is where testing assumptions really matter. So one tool, separate to that, one tool I find useful to identifying roles is actually a tool we all know, which is using the stakeholder wheel. I think the stakeholder wheel complements looking at roles very well, and then it leads very well to looking at the tasks that the roles do. So that's my.
Yeah, good, wicked combo, good combo. Debbie, come on.
Actually, Colin's got his hand up again, Lawrence. So I just wondered if you might want to go to Colin first.
I can't see him on my screen. It might. I'm staring at the chat, so I can't see everyone on the screen. Go on, Colin. We'll unmute you again, young man.
Yeah, it was just to say one of the things that I used to run 5 call centres around the UK at one point, and one of the things about getting to know your customer is I used to like looking at the complaints, because that's such a useful information to look at the complaints. And I would actually phone complainants myself, personally, and ask them, not just was your complaint satisfied in, to your satisfaction, but what would have stopped you making the complaint in the first place? So what was wrong with what we did? What was wrong the way we engaged with you? And I was actually pulled up by a senior person, said I shouldn't be phoning complainants directly, but I just continued to do it anyway, because I just think it's very useful to hear them say, the reason I complained is because you got my name wrong 5 times, or something like on a document. You think, okay, how did that make you feel? Because in a complaint, you just think, oh, sorry about that, we've changed it. And it doesn't really get to the thing. And I think customers are a great source of ideas for how you can improve your service. So yeah, I would say if you've got access to complaints, go and have a dig into them, have a read of them, and randomly contact some customers and see how they would improve things.
The scariest thing is you might even get someone who's a service designer as a customer. So that might be.
that would be ideal, wouldn't it?
Yes, I've heard some of Debbie's stories about giving feedback to companies, but we're not going to go there today.
But actually, Lawrence,
thanks, Colin.
Colin's comment ties right into what I was going to say. So that was really helpful, because I was going to talk about anti-techniques, the opposite, which is basically that sometimes we have techniques and we use them as a tick list. And what we don't actually do is actively listen and actively empathize and actively analyze. And so my biggest tips are to actually not just create models and fill in forms or diagrams, because we've all been on the receiving end of those, rate our service emails and all this sort of thing. And it just feels like something where actually you're just asked to do something very simplistic in a situation that's often very complex. And if we're analysts, we mustn't lose that sense of complexity. And if we really want to find out, I completely agree with what Colin said. And one of the concepts as a persona that I sometimes think about is the non-customer persona. And I think about this because, and I'm sure we've all done it, I go into stores sometimes looking for something that I know they sell, okay? And I go in and I look and it's dreadful and I walk out again. So I've gone in as a willing person with money to buy something and I've walked out. If you then spoke to me, I'm not going to complain, I'm just not going to do anything. You would find out ever such a lot about your company. So actually understanding the opposite sometimes of something is quite useful. And Kay mentioned assumptions, and assumption reversal is a technique that ties into this as well. And I would recommend that.
Thanks for that. I'm going to try one further question. Maybe well, it's quite a lot to go into with 6 minutes left, but we've got quite an interesting mix of attendees. We've got business analysts, we've got service designers, we've got people doing sort of both roles, various different bits of experience. But can you give us some from the panel in terms of where you see those differences between service design and business analysis, if anything? Do you want to have a crack at that, Jonathan?
Okay, so I'll make a start. So I think historically business analysts have been told not to talk about solutions. You should talk about requirements and not talk about solutions. And one of the challenges for a business analyst moving into the service design space is overcoming that barrier to talk about solutions, to talk about ideas, to talk about prototypes and testing and learning. And I think that there's a bit of a mindset difference. A service designer who's not got a business analysis background will be very comfortable talking about solutions and concepts and prototypes. And some business analysts may have a fear to move beyond the boundary of a what, in terms of a want or a need, and into how we might deliver that solution and what might be the service or the product. And I feel that this is one of the tensions between the two roles, and it's a difference between the two roles. And in the end, we should be moving towards, irrespective of our role, towards customer-focused outcomes that work for the customers and the organizations. And we need to put aside our fears of talking about a solution, if we have them, if we're business analysts and we've been told we can't do that. We need to be very mindful when we do cross the Rubicon from talking about a want through to a how we might deliver the solution. Be mindful not to do that too early and to challenge our assumptions, but we've got to get more comfortable moving between a what and a how is my perception. Yeah,
it's a nice way of thinking about it. I'm going to get 1 minute from you each. Kay, do you want to talk through, because you've had a bit of this as a personal career journey as well?
Yes, so I moved from business analyst role to service designer role to moving back to business analyst role, but now I'm doing both a BA role and a service design role. And I think the kind of key difference is the way you work as a BA and or a service designer. I feel that with service design, it's often more focused on co-creation. That's not to say BAs don't co-create. It's the tools that service designers often adopt enable that co-creation. And I think also the stakeholders that service designers work with are slightly different to business analysts. But that's not to say that BAs can't work with the stakeholders. So for example, I'm specifically thinking about end customers or end users are often involved in the service design kind of methodologies, whereas business analysts don't often end up working with end users or customers.
It's a shift, isn't it? Yeah. Pip, can you add to that?
Yeah, so I'm a career changer, so I've come late to business analysis after a different career, and the boundaries between the two formally are very blurred for me, because also in the job that I do, I am all things to all people. So for me, how I look at it is, depending on whether I'm doing service design work or business analysis work, it's almost like my hovering height. So when I'm doing business analysis work, I tend to be further into the detail. I'm looking at the specifics of transactions between business processes or between the business processes and the systems or whatever. When I'm doing more service design work, I always feel like I'm taking a higher hovering height. So I'm assuming that these business processes are doing what they need to do for the sake of my service design work. And then I'm floating between the two. So I'm looking end to end of a solution when I'm service designing, and I'm looking end to end in terms of operational processes and procedures and systems when I'm doing business analysis work.
It's a nice way of thinking about it. If you can do both, if you've got a license, that's, yes, I get that. Debbie, can you finish off for us, perhaps?
I'm not sure I can add anything to the 3 descriptions that's just been given, but the one thing I will say is that it all needs an understanding of strategic context. And I do think that sometimes when we talk about service design and when we talk about business analysis, it's focused in quite a detailed way. And actually, what Pip and Kay just said about actually taking that slightly high level view, and I always think organizations set their objectives, they have a strategy to achieve them, and then there's these tactics that execute that strategy. Service designers and business analysts are very firmly in there, and they are helping to achieve service outcomes by putting in place the operational practices that make it work. That's my summary.
Thank you for summing. I can see people are saying thanks. I know people have got to drop off. We weren't going to cover all of this today. I think we've covered a fantastic amount. Some excellent questions. Sorry if I haven't picked up everything in the chat, and I must improve my raised hand seeing skills for future webinars. So thanks for being with us. And we'll get this recording set up so people want to re-access it. I know there's some people have missed it, and but hopefully there's always nuggets in these sessions, and hopefully you got some really solid takeaways today. Thank you, Jonathan, for all that work in prepping. Debbie, Kay, Pip, giving it your time and the preparation for today. Some really useful insights, a great cross section, and thanks all for joining us.